We've now wrapped up the portion of our application that calls for some amount of list building. So here's our list. We can see all the items, and in theory, if we had a whole bunch of them, we could scroll through and have a really good time. So that side of things looks pretty good. We're going to pivot a little bit now and focus on how to handle a user tapping on a single row. So remember the goal of the application. Whenever a user taps on a row, that row should expand with a nice animation and show the user some details about that very particular library. So if you recall much earlier, we discussed how we were going to plan out the different reducers in our application. We were going to have one library reducer, which we've already created, and then we were also going to have a selection reducer. And the purpose of the selection reducer is just to record what the currently selected library is. Each library has an ID attached to it, so the selection reducer can just record the currently selected ID and everything should work out just fine. So in this section, we're going to start by working on the selection reducer. Remember the process for creating a new reducer. They always go into their own separate file inside of our reducers folder. So in the reducers folder, I'll create a new file called selection reducer.js. Then inside of here, we need to declare basically our starting reducer. So I will export default a fat arrow function. And this fat arrow function is going to serve as our reducer. Now we need to have some initial state for this application. We need to have some initial value that the reducer will return when our Redux app first boots up. One thing that I haven't really mentioned quite in depth yet about this initial value is that it cannot be undefined. So in previous sections, when we created that library reducer and we had that kind of dummy reducer in there that would always return an array, I was returning an array just to make sure that we did not return undefined. Redux is set up to assume that if you return undefined from a reducer, you probably made a mistake. So we always have to return a value that is not undefined. So to start, we'll just return null. Hey, that works. It is not undefined, so it satisfies that requirement. It makes sure that in the case that we call this thing at any point in time, when the application first boots up, we do not want to have a pre-selected row. So we don't want to default to say a ID of 1 or ID 2 or anything like that. So I will say just null. We do not currently have a row selected. Okay, our reducer is pretty much good enough to wire it up. So let's now flip over to our index.js file inside the reducers directory. Remember that for every reducer we create, we have to wire it up to this combine reducers call. So inside of the index.js, I will import selection reducer from selection reducer. And now I need to add it into my combine reducers call. Remember the really important thing about combine reducers. Whatever key I provide in here for the selection reducer is how this property will show up on my state object. So I'm going to say that I want to have a property on my state object called, how about, I think I've got it in a couple diagrams here. What did I use? Selected library ID. Let's go with that. So I'm going to have a piece of state called selected library ID. Oops. There we go. And the value of this piece of state will be generated by my selection reducer. So now when my application first boots up, the selection reducer will execute exactly one time, and by default it will just return null. So by default we do not have a selected library. Okay, let's now flip back over to our list item component. This list item component here needs to know about whether or not it is currently selected, which means this list item component needs to get access to our Redux state. Once we get access to Redux state inside this component, we can compare the value of that selected library ID to this.props.library ID. And if they are equal, that means that this particular library is currently selected. So that'll be our next step. Let's take care of that in the next section.